Hi everyone, and welcome to Lab 6. We're going to be continuing our adventures in neuropsychology, and what I want to do in this video is give a brief overview of some of the things you will need to do in order to address the questions for this assignment. So if we recall our lab from last week, we read this Race et al. 2015 paper, and we answered some questions pertaining to the results of that paper and interpreting them. What we'll be doing in this lab is actually working with the data that comes from this paper so that we can replicate the analyses that were conducted. Now, in getting started, please make sure that you download the race_r zip folder from our very first lab. You may actually recognize this folder since we actually took the R script from there and ran it just to make sure that RStudio would run that code properly. So if you were wondering, are we ever going to come back to that script? Are we actually going to work through it and interpret and understand what the output means? This is the opportunity for us to actually do that. So again, make sure that you have the files in this folder, and also make sure that of those files, you've pulled out this Excel questions Excel file and put it on your desktop so that way we can take a look at the data. So, I have here the spreadsheet with the data. And if we just take a look at this for a moment and examine it to see what we have going on here, we can see that we have some information for experiment 1. Now there are multiple tabs here, but in this video we're just going to focus on this very first one for experiment 1. So I have some information pertaining to our control group as well as our patient group. I see that I have a measurement of percent correct. In the paper, this was referred to as the proportion of words recalled correctly. We have different contexts in which these words were presented, whether they were shown in a sentence or in a list. And we also have the sequence length, as you can see denoted by 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 for the sentence context, and the same for the list context. So what the very first question is asking you to do is to inspect a specific cell and pull out the formula that is being calculated there. So we're going to go to cell C34. And if we click on it, we see that it is computing some sort of average of values in column I for rows 4 through 19. And so the question that it's asking you once you paste this formula into your document is, for what group and for what condition is that particular average being calculated for? So you're going to do the same thing for cell J34 as well. And the rest of these questions are just sort of asking you to explore different aspects of this Excel spreadsheet. You may click on this graph here and see what is associated with this particular bar, etc., etc. What I now want to do is move on to the RStudio portion of this assignment. So please make sure that you have opened up this project and you've opened up the script so that way we can run some lines of code. So here I have my script, and one of the things that I do want to point out before we move on is that you will notice that there's various comments here in green, and these comments are actually going to denote specific lines that correspond to particular questions in our assignment, such that Q3 is going to have code that pertains to the questions for number 3. Same with Q4 is going to have code that pertains to questions for number 4, so on and so forth. So for question 3A, it's going to ask us to execute these lines of code here, and we're going to report how many subjects are displayed here in this little table and what group they're in. And so we can note that we have 6 rows, therefore we have 6 subjects. And if we're looking for group, we're going to have to identify the various names here we have for our columns. So we have ID, group, lesion, length, context, and percent correct, or proportion of words recalled correctly. And so the group we're looking at is the control group. Now for the next question, 3B, we're going to be asked to identify the number of rows and columns in the data set as a whole. And so one way of doing that is to go to your Environment tab, where you can see all of your R objects. You can click on Experiment 1 Data, and we can see our data frame here. Another way to access this information is to type View and then insert the object that you want to look at. If you run that, you'll have the same thing here. And so the important piece is making sure that we've got the total number of entries or rows and the total number of columns. Now, for question 4 and the remaining questions, what we're going to be asked to do is to look at how we specify our model with R code and how we can effectively read and interpret that model output. So, if we go to the lines that correspond to question 4, we can see where we specified our ANOVA test and where we can actually put that into a table to look at our output nice and cleanly. So what it's asking us to do is to look at the input parameters for this ANOVA test function, and we're going to identify what the dependent variable is, or DV. We have DV is equal to PC, or our dependent variable should be the percent correct or proportion of words recalled correctly. Then what we want to do is we want to make sure that we can clearly identify what our between subject independent variable is, as well as our within subject independent variables. We want to know how many levels they have and what the names of those levels are. And we can see that here as we specify between is equal to GP or group. And hopefully from the papers, as well as the assignment from last week, we're aware of the two groups that we have, the control group and our patient group. And we have within, with these two variables being length as well as context. And hopefully we're aware of what the context is from reading the paper, such that the words can either be presented in a list or they can be presented in a sentence. So once you have identified this information here, we're actually going to ask you to run this ANOVA and grab the output. You're going to copy this table and you're going to paste it into your document and change the font to something that'll be more legible, like Courier, for example. Now for 4E, it's asking us which numbered line of this ANOVA output addresses the question, did the size of the sentence superiority effect differ between amnesic patients and normal control subjects? Now you may recall from last week's assignment that we had this exact same question, and when we were answering it, the hint that we gave you was to think about if this question is asking you about a main effect. We can see our main effects here from lines 1 to 3. Or is it asking about an interaction? We can see from lines 4 through 7. And if you recall from last week's assignment, we talked about how this specific question about the size of the sentence superiority effect and whether it differed between amnesic patients and normal control subjects is going to be asking for an interaction. In particular, we're going to be looking at the interaction between group and context. So the line that'll answer this question should be line number 5. And you can actually compare your answers here to what's in the paper, such that if we go to the section where they talk about the results for experiment 1, we can see the magnitude of the sentence superiority effect did not differ across groups. This is the interaction of context and group. And this F statistic and this p-value should correspond to what you found in your output here. And so then what you'll want to do for the remaining questions is provide the answer to this above question and why we're able to interpret it in that way. And honestly, the rest of the questions are going to ask you to do very similar things, where you're going to paste some output, you're going to identify which lines of that output are going to allow you to answer specific questions, and so on. So yeah, that's all I have for you in this video. If you have any questions about this assignment, feel free to ask in lab or shoot me an email and we can discuss them there. Thank you for listening, and good luck!